Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Reptile Barn. I wanted to address veterinary care when it comes to having reptiles because I think it's a lot different from your more traditional pets. So I just wanted to dive in a few thoughts that I've had on what you should be prepared for if you have a pet reptile. So, very first off, something to keep in mind is that most vets are not going to be able to help you with your reptile. They are trained most of the time in dogs and cats. Then you have some that are, equine vets or whatever. Some that will work with like farm animals, and then you have exotics vets, and that's who you want. Uh, it is very different. And some vets that aren't exotics vets will try to help, but if they're honest, they'll be the first to tell you like they're not fully trained in exotics, so they're gonna do their best, kind of thing, right? But what you really need is an exotics vet. So keep that in mind. Some places have a good selection of exotics vets, some do not. So I always would recommend before you get your animal, check your area for vets first. You don't want to get in a bind at some point where something's going wrong and now you're scrambling to find a good exotics vet. Expect to have to do some driving if you don't live in a big city. That's just, you may get lucky and not have to, but don't be surprised if it's like, oh, I have to drive for 45 minutes to get to this vet. That may be the case. So, again, I'm not disparaging typical vets at all. They do fantastic work. But you really are going to need an exotics vet to help you with most of the issues that come up with reptiles. So that's just something to keep in mind. Second, and I think this is kind of a related, be prepared kind of idea, it's generally smart, and it's always smart, to have a reserve of money set aside for a medical emergency. No one wants to have to put a vet visit on your credit card. So, in my experience, and I live in a pretty expensive state, so maybe it's a little bit better in some places. It's probably a little worse in others. Your typical exam for a reptile is, for me, $85. If you need medications, they're usually not bad if it's something like an antibiotic. I've bought antibiotics for $30 before. Something more extreme like X-rays, those are very expensive, several $100s usually. Certainly a surgery. We one time had an egg-bound snake. We didn't end up doing surgery on that one, but they were doing all sorts of ultrasounds and palpitations, and that got pretty expensive. We've had abscesses removed. Again, this snake has to get a local anesthetic and then be completely sedated. The actual surgery has to take place, and it's very small, delicate facial bones. And then they have to monitor the animal until it's woken back up and is acting normally. So that was very expensive. I want to say $700 or $800, maybe more. So, and that was just removing an abscess they didn't have to open up, the body cavity or anything like that. It would get more expensive as you go. So just have some money on hand that's set aside when you're budgeting to buy your animal, and you're like, okay, the tank's going to be this much, the decor is going to be this much, the animal itself is going to be this much. I want to have 2 months of food in the freezer. It's going to cost this much. The substrate, yada yada. Just if you're saving up money anyways to get this animal, if you want to do it completely correctly, I think it's wise to have your vet visit budget in hand before you get your animal. That being said, reptiles, most of the commonly kept species, I should say, that are captive bred, that's a key, coming from a reputable source, that's a second key, are very healthy animals. Of my 200 reptiles, we go to the vet maybe once or twice per year, typically. The vast majority of these animals will never go to the vet. And that's something I want to get into as well. When you, like our dogs, they have annual visits, right? And they're dogs. They like people. Some dogs I know are terrified of the vet, but usually you're not going to traumatize your dog for weeks and weeks and weeks or put it off of food just by visiting the vet for a checkup. And there's so many things that they watch with dogs and cats that you really do need to go in and get your animal a checkup, right? At the very least, to get its shots, right? Vaccines and stuff, and rabies shots. You don't want to skip that. Um, Reptiles, in my opinion, is a little different. I am of the school of thought that most reptiles are going to be stressed out a little bit more than a dog or cat would be. Even a very docile, friendly snake, for example, by a vet grabbing it, which they have to do. They're very good at what they do, but I mean, there's certain things they just have to do. You know, opening its mouth, holding it still if you're taking scans and things like that, you know, restraining it. That's very, very stressful for your reptile. I think more so, even though your dog or your cat might react way worse in the moment, peeing everywhere or squealing or whatever. You get home, 10 minutes later, your animal's fine. Most of the time. Someone maybe in the comments is gonna tell me a great story about their cat is an exception, but for the most part, your animal's fine. A reptile, you know, it might affect its appetite going forward. It might really stress out. And so I don't necessarily recommend going in for regular checkups. And the second reason for that, well, there's three reasons for that. First is that added stress. Second, there's only so many things that they can look at on your reptile. You know, we take our dog and they can check hip mobility, they can check for arthritis, they can look for issues with gums and teeth. Do they need a cleaning? They can look for a bunch of things. You're getting a lot of data when you take in your dog or your cat for just a regular checkup. You know, a snake, they're going to listen to the heartbeat. They might listen to the lungs, make sure there's no fluid in there. They'll weigh it, see how the weight is progressing over the years. I mean, there's some things they are going to get, but it's just not nearly as much use to you, in my opinion. Again, if you guys want to take your reptile in, this is your animal. You do what you think is best. Trust your gut. But for me, they're not getting enough data from a regular checkup to be worth going in. Again, that's just my opinion. And third, of course, you don't need any shots. There's no, your snake can't carry rabies. Your bearded dragon can't carry rabies. You don't need all these preemptive shots trying to avoid things. I don't believe that you can inoculate against salmonella, which is one of the few things that your reptile could carry, right? Your dog can get immunized for kennel cough. That's not a thing with snakes. So I don't know that an annual checkup really is in your or your animal's best interest. That's all I'm saying. If you think it is, go for it. That's great. Just sharing my thoughts here. And the last thing I wanted to get into really quick is just, what do you go to the vet for? What should you be watching for? What should concern you? What shouldn't concern you? And this is going to be controversial. I've gotten raked over the coals for my take on this before, and I probably will again, but just sharing my thoughts. I consider a respiratory infection an emergency with a reptile. Go to the vet. Get your antibiotics. Get them started immediately. If you catch a respiratory infection in its early stages, very early stages, and you get on antibiotics, usually you're fine. You'll kick that thing's butt. If you don't, your reptile very well may die. It becomes serious extremely quickly. That manifests often in, open mouth breathing, tons of yawning. Don't freak out if your reptile yawns every once in a while, but if it's like really yawning a lot, it may be trying to get extra air. a gurgly breath, wheezing, if there's fluid discharge from the mouth or the nose, that's a big one. Um, so just pay close attention to your animal because those are all signs of a respiratory infection. Um, Injuries, burns, all of those things, go to the vet immediately, right? I hope none of you are using those hot rocks that go inside the tank that notoriously malfunction and burn your reptile. But if that has ever happened to you and you see a burn, don't wait. Just take them in. Um, First off, you need pain management. This animal is in agony. They don't cry and whimper like a dog would, but they're in pain. They have very sensitive pain receptors, like many animals do. Um, the obvious stuff. If there's an injury, something's clearly broken, or a wound, or a burn, all of those, even minor ones, go to the vet. That is not something that any untrained person should be trying to deal with at home. Um, then there's other things to look for that are kind of reptile specific, like scale rot. If you notice teeny tiny, like one scale seems to be a little bit discolored or something, and oh, I have been keeping it a little too wet in there, something like that, dry it out. Maybe even put on a little bit of like antifungal cream right on that scale. Not if it's around the mouth or anything like that, but on the body, and watch it. Check it daily. I'm pretty comfortable saying that if it's a teeny tiny, tiny, tiny little patch of scale rot, you can try treating that on your own. If it's a bigger patch or if it's not going away, go to the vet. Get professional help. And that's really a reptile thing, right? Obviously, it's a scale. Only so many things have scales, but that can become very serious. Mites. I don't think of this as really a veterinary visit, but it is a medical issue that needs to be dealt with. Um, don't mistake, wood lice that came in on the substrate or springtails that are in there on purpose for snake mites. But if you do have snake mites, you want to nip that in the bud. Take care of it immediately. I would recommend using a professional product like Prevenamite. I've heard of others. I haven't used anything else except Prevenamite, so I hesitate to endorse anything. But there are other products on the market for mite prevention, or rather mite, destruction, I guess. Actually, I should say there's one other thing I have used. And by the way, I've never had snake mites, but these are just I've had Prevenamite cans that I've given to people because I've had them on the shelf for 5 years and never had to use it. But when I buy a new animal, even if it's from the best of the best breeder that I trust implicitly, I still prep the enclosure with Prevenamite before I put this new animal in. So that's when I say I have experience with these things. I don't mean eradicating mites. I just mean I've used this product. What I've done recently, though, actually, that I like better, because more and more of my enclosures are bioactive, and I have springtails in there. I have isopods. I have beetles and worms and stuff in the enclosure. I don't want to spray Prevenamite all around my place. I have been buying predatory mites, and I'm loving it. They have a bunch of different kinds of them, and some of them I talked to the company on the phone, and I'm like, none of yours list that they eat reptile mites. Do any of these though? Would any of these work? And they talked me through it. Yeah, this is what you want to order. I get them. They're not very expensive. I order them like 50,000 at a time, and I can just go and plunk a little bit of the substrate that's full of these predatory mites into all of my tubs, all my enclosures, all my cages, and if there were snake mites in there, they'll wipe them out, which I just think is fantastic. I love that. So I don't have to spray any chemicals. I don't have to risk my springtails and stuff in my other enclosures. Now, I'm guessing that if any of these predatory mites escaped the tub, got into another tub that had springtails in it, and they couldn't find any snake mites, but they see these nice little springtails crawling around, they might eat the springtails. So I might have to wait a few weeks and reseed that enclosure with springtails. That's fine though. I'm not upset with that. I'm not gonna hurt my isopods. I'm not gonna hurt my worms or anything like that if a few predatory mites accidentally get in there. So mites, typically I say use a chemical, especially if there's an infestation. I think you just have to at that point, because mites can just make reptile keeping miserable. You know, the constant cleaning, and people, I've heard of them rubbing them in olive oil, and they're just bathing them constantly. So much work. Even people who only have 3 or 4 snakes, it's a nightmare. But you imagine someone with 50 snakes, or some of these massive, and people with 10,000 reptiles, which that blows my mind, by the way, that that's even a sentence I can say. But mites would be a nightmare. And if the infestation becomes bad enough, they are also dangerous to your snake or your lizard or your whatever, right? So take it seriously. Yeah, if you're a breeder, things like egg binding, very, very serious problem. May require surgical intervention. But the last one I want to touch on super quick is constipation. And I guess really impaction. So those have 2 different causes, even though it's a similar thing happening. Impaction is when they swallow something that's a foreign object they're not supposed to swallow, and they can't pass it. They can't digest it and break it down, and they also can't get it out. And it builds up in there, and it causes a blockage. It's potentially very dangerous. That's absolutely cause to go to the vet. Okay, you see your animal straining to poop, for example, and just can't. Very possibly could be impaction. Take them in, get it checked just in case. It's going to be expensive. They'll have to scan, an X-ray or whatever, and look for a blockage. But do it. You don't want your animal. And what a horrible way to die. Just Anyways, yeah, impaction is bad. Constipation. If you suspect constipation, like you're like, oh, I know that my substrate can't possibly be the issue. Excuse me, because maybe this is an arboreal animal that is up on smooth branches. It doesn't have substrate that it can swallow, something like that. But it's still acting that way. Like, oh, maybe it's constipated. That's typically either eating the wrong food, it's just not digesting fast enough, or maybe it's a little too cold and it's not digesting very well, or it's just not humid enough, right? Or a combination of these things, right? Maybe just too big of a meal, too close together, or whatever causes it, right? Or he just got a stomach bug and he's got indigestion. I don't know. If you're a little bit worried about this, but you're not really sure that's what's going on, soak your snake. Just give him a good soak. A couple inches, lukewarm water, 80 degrees, 85 degrees. Give him an hour or 2 in the water. Do that once a day for several days. You may be surprised, and a huge, gigantic bowel movement comes out in the water one of these times, right? That's what you want. It's disgusting, but you're now relieved because your animal is not constipated. If he still seems like he's just off, he's not passing anything, he seems really big and full down there, right? But he's not pooping, go to the vet. They can help you. It shouldn't be some sort of like life-threatening problem if you catch it early and you get help and you do what you need to. So that is all. This became a much longer video than I expected, but I wanted a one-stop place to put down all my thoughts on all these different veterinary or medical type issues that come up with reptile keeping, specifically because it's such a different world than dogs and cats and the the pets that a lot of people grow up with, right? And it can be overwhelming. You're like, what is wrong with my snake? What is wrong with my lizard? What's going on? And I didn't touch on everything. Things like stuck shed are typically not dangerous. Usually don't need medical intervention from a vet, but you still need to deal with. So I'm just trying to give you guys the most common things that could go wrong with your animal and whether it's something I personally would go to the vet for or I wouldn't. And I think most of those things I listed, I would go to the vet for. I have gone to the vet for, right? And the vast majority of them, by the way, are treatable. You don't have to lose your animal over this. You know, I once did lose an animal with an enlarged heart. Nothing you can do about that. It was a genetic defect in my animal, right? That was devastating. Absolutely devastating. But many of the problems that go on, you can deal with if you catch them quickly. And if you're ready with your, your saved up vet visit slush fund, right? And you've done your digging and you know who the good exotics vets in your area are, you can feel a little bit more calm and empowered that I know what to do. I know where to go. This is an issue I think I should go to the vet for. Here's where I'm going. And they'll get you taken care of. So hope that was helpful. It was long. I don't expect very many people to watch this unless you're having some sort of problem and you're trying to look on the internet or on YouTube for solutions. Maybe you'll come across this. Maybe it'll be years from now. But I hope it was helpful. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, we're the Reptile Barn.